This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me. There's no question that the October No Kings protests were a huge success. Millions of people turned out in every state and every major metro area and many rural areas to show their opposition to Donald Trump. But what comes next? That is a very important question. And it's one that past left of center protest movements have had a real difficulty answering in recent years. Now, there's no question that it is important to show up and be with people who have similar political values to you. And yet, people who want to build a better world have to build it among themselves first before they can have it in society at large. To defeat Trumpism, you have to replace it by answering the questions that it purports to answer and by reaching people that Democrats in recent years have not been interested in reaching. And I wanted to talk about them today with Deva Woodly. She is a professor of political science at Brown University, and she's a research fellow at the Charles Kettering Foundation, where she studies political movements. She's also the author of two books on the subject as well: The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance, and also Reckoning, Black Lives Matter, and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. I hope you'll enjoy. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, technology, media, religion, and how they all combine to create our culture. And if you like what we're doing, we have subscription options on both Patreon and Substack. Just go to patreon.com/discoverflux and you can subscribe over there. And if you go to flux.community, you can subscribe that way on Substack. And if you're a paid subscribing member, you have unlimited access to all the archives. And I thank you very much for your support. All right, let's get into the program. And joining me now is Deva Woodly. Hey, Deva, welcome to Theory of Change.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be a great discussion, I think. So, before we get into it, though, can you just give the audience a little bit about your background and some of the things that you study and how you got into that?
Absolutely, sure. I'm a professor of political science at Brown University, and I study social movements, political participation, public meaning, and discourse. And I also am just generally interested in how ordinary people impact politics, and particularly how movements are able to create political change.
Okay, yeah, and so the focus of our discussion today is going to be, yeah, exactly that. But in the context of the recent No Kings protests that we saw across the country, and whether they can turn into something else bigger and more, that does something really big, make some real change in the country. So this is the second protest that we just saw, and a lot of people showed up for these things. But I don't know. Do you think? What do you think? Are they? I think there's more things that have to be done afterward.
Oh, absolutely, right. One of the things that we've found in the 21st century cycle of protests that we've had that really began, I think, with the 1999 protests against the WTO and the IMF, are that we have had increasingly large demonstrations, right? So increasingly large public demonstrations in the street. However, we have had these large demonstrations at the same time that we've had declines in civil society organizations across the spectrum, but particularly on the center to the left. And when I say civil society organizations, I mean those organizations that are independently organized, not only for political purposes, but for the purposes of getting people together to do something, right? Or getting people together for leisure time or to enjoy some kind of interest. As we know from Robert Putnam's work and from Theda Skocpol's work, these kinds of organizations have been in decline basically since the 1970s. So you have a little bit of a mismatch between the capacity for mobilization, which we've been seeing increasing, but the capacity for organizing, which we've been seeing decreasing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this has been something that's been true, across the various cycles that we've had. So, I mean, there were a bunch of different protest movements since that anti-WTO. We had, the Iraq War
Mhm.
protests. We had Occupy Wall Street, the Women's March, Black Lives Matter. Um, all of these organizations, they had a lot of people supporting their cause, but I
Mhm.
think when you look at them compared to the Tea
Mhm.
Party really did go a lot further, I feel like.
Well, I think that the Tea Party actually disbanded, right? It is now like not extant. But it's true that the way that the Tea Party was organized was based in local civic communities, right? They were organized around local groups that were largely autonomous, although they did take funding from large right wing donors and organizations that had money as they developed. But they were very careful, and this is actually all recorded in a really wonderful book by Theda Skocpol. Um, um, I think it's The Rise of the Tea Party and the Redefinition of the Republican Party or something like that. But one of the things that is observed in that book is that these civic organizations were really careful about remaining autonomous in terms of their agenda. And they were careful about the things that they took money for. And so, what you really had was a group of civic organizations that became well resourced over time and then developed a particular relationship with the Republican Party. And that's the other thing that I do think that um, we need to be really clear about is that the Tea Party movement in particular, but right wing movements generally speaking, have had a different kind of reception in the Republican Party than left wing movements have within the Democratic Party. There was an alliance that has now morphed into kind of a takeover. And I know that the takeover part of it, well, you know better than I do, Matthew, the takeover part of it was not seamless and amiable. But the affiliation that did happen between the Tea Party and the Republican Party was one that was much more congenial than the Democratic Party tends to have with its left wing movements. And this is something that we see in the literature as asymmetric polarization, but also we see this in terms of just the asymmetric politics of the Democratic and Republican Party and their tolerance for their respective movements.
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly true. And the reason for that, I think, is that when you go back and look at the history, that you see that these further right uh, activists, they put media as the centerpiece of what they were doing,
Mm,
because they understood that our ideas are not regnant in the Republican Party. So William F. Buckley, as an example of that, he started National Review because he hated Dwight Eisenhower. That was
mhm,
actually why National Review got started, because they thought Dwight Eisenhower was a rhino, Republican in name only.
mm,
And so they made it their mission to convince the Republican voters first and to change them in terms of who they were.
mhm.
And that's not the way that further left movements in the U.S. have tended to behave. Instead, what they tend to do, in my view, is that they use moral appeals to decency or goodness, or like that's what they tend to emphasize rather than pragmatic appeals. And so as a result, people who are Democrats that have a more pragmatic psychological orientation, they tend to view these movements with suspicion, and
Well,
think they're delusional.
I don't think that the pragmatic or not pragmatic distinction is the one. I do think that because, as you say, right, it's a question of strategy and the way that strategy aligns with resources, right? So it is not the case that the things that are published in the National Review back in the time of William F. Buckley or today are particularly more pragmatic than things that are published in Mother Jones. It's the difference between how those organizations are resourced and then what relationship those organizations are able to build or make with decision makers. It's also about the audience that they're able to build over time. But I think something else that you said, I think, is also quite key, is that uh, the folks who wanted to be influential on the right thought that they could change the voters of the Republican Party. And I think that that is something that is not as believed on the center to the left, that you can change the beliefs of the people who are your constituents, that they can be persuaded. There is instead this belief that people have some sort of inherent orientation that you have to tap into, right? And that it's not necessarily worth trying to change. And I do think that that is a really big and significant difference in terms of the perception of who people are and how they work. Because I think that it's the difference between a kind of evangelical frame of mind where people can get saved and a kind of um, Marxist frame of mind. And when I say Marxist, I just mean like scientific, right? A scientific politics, right? Like that's what Marx says he's doing. I'm telling you the science of how politics works. So it's a really different orientation where you believe people can change, right, in a kind of fundamental way, or you believe that people are as they are and you have to figure out how to tap into that or how to teach them how things really are, which is quite a different orientation.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, well, and that's why they use media. Like that was why they put it
Mhm.
as their centerpiece, and what's so bizarre though to me is that when that how today's modern further left movements or have the self-conception of what's possible or how to do it. It's like they didn't really pay attention to a lot of the older movements, like the original, 20th century Black civil rights movement. Like that was a movement that was a multi-pronged effort. It was one that, yes, they had protests, but they also had, they had candidates that they supported in primaries. They
Well,
had,
so
um,
does this movement. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a mythology about protest being the only tactic of contemporary left movements. That's not true. There are lots of progressive candidates running and winning all over the country. They are just
Mhm.
not as embraced by the party. So you don't get necessarily the glossy profiles on them. They are not touted as the new stars of the party. They are not funded with an open checkbook the way that you would have or that you do see on the right for their sort of rising stars. They're also not giving leadership positions within the party, even when they win. By all rights, somebody like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez should be like running the joint right now, and I mean that in terms of what she's shown in terms of her ability to win a broad constituency, to increase her numbers in terms of votes every single term, to raise so much money that she can say almost whatever she wants, um, and to really learn how to sort of like play the game from her perspective, and at the same time be quite respected across the spectrum of the Democratic Party in terms of its rank, uh, its members in Congress, but then also across its rank and file. She has supporters among moderates. She has supporters among the most left wing. And so I just hold that up in terms of like, this is the kind of candidate and representative who, if she were a right wing member, would be heading up so many different committees, would have already been pitched as in a leadership role on the sort of like national sort of executive level. And you see the same thing kind of happening with Zoran Mamdani, who's clearly a generationally talented politician, who has been only reluctantly embraced by um, uh, by the decision makers within the party. So it's not the case that movements don't aren't aware of and don't run candidates. It's not even the case that they don't win; they do. It's really about a different kind of relationship with decision makers.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely agree they don't treat them in that way. But it's also the case though that the right forced this to happen. And so like
That is
the
true.
Buckleys and his generation, like they were. they were hated in the Republican Party. They
Sure.
saw them as a liability. They saw
Hmm.
them as crazy losers. And and when they, you know, muscled their way to have Barry Goldwater as their nominee, they got
Hmm.
completely destroyed in the 1964 presidential
Hmm.
election.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's so there is that parallel. But I guess what the difference is to me is that the left, the modern day left, it wants to appeal to the goodness of party leaders or the generosity instead of just saying, no, we're going to take this power and we're going to
Yes.
do it.
I
That's the difference.
I agree with you there. But it's, yeah, no, and I think that that is, again, I do think that that is changing. Um, but you're right. I do think that, um, I mean, it's just a matter of history that that wing, the wing of the Republican Party that is now ascendant, right, and dominant, it was definitely hated in the middle 20th century. But the people who were really committed to that point of view kept investing in their institutions. And I do think that that is a fundamental difference. One of the things that happens on the left is that with every kind of setback, right, or something that's perceived as a setback, or near miss, the tendency is to withdraw from its movement organizations, to stop investing in the media organs, um, the sort of the reporters, the organizers, the bloggers who are really sort of pushing the point of view and the policy solutions and the world view that is characteristic of the American left. The tendency for those with resources is to withdraw from those things. Um, and that is the exact opposite tendency that persisted on the right in the middle 20th century. And I think that is a very serious lesson to be learned. Now, I should say that I do think that people are learning that lesson right now, but it needs to be taken up with much more speed, right? That understanding that you have to be actually committed to the thing and you have to be willing to believe that you can change people's minds if they're not with you or get the word out, right? That you can stand behind things that are unpopular for the time that they're unpopular until you make them popular, which is the thing that happens, right, over time. So I absolutely agree with you. There are so many lessons to be learned. But, you know, uh, it's it, it's really about developing a different relationship between movement folks and folks with resources. Although there are some movement folks who have resources now, increasingly, but even so, that I think is certainly the key.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, that local component, as you
Yes,
were saying, is so critical. And
that's true.
and some of it, yeah, I think a lot of it, why this is kind of lacking or has been lacking recently in the American left is due to the decline of unions in the country.
Mhm.
So unions used to be the backbone of a lot of left organizing in the United States, and as membership has declined in those organizations, and I have to fault those organizations to some degree about not trying to evangelize for what they were doing to the public. Um, you know,
Completely agree. Yes, and we're in total agreement there. Yeah, unions and churches, right? So two things have happened. So
yeah,
the decline of unions, which in the middle 20th century was allowed to happen, right, by leaders in unions. They decided to be clientelist unions instead of political unions, right? Instead of sort of making their case to the public and trying to increase their memberships, they decided to focus on winning the next contract, right? With the members that they had. Now, of course, unions faced all sorts of headwinds. I shouldn't, it wasn't purely voluntary. There were a lot of political forces arrayed against unions. At the same time, there were also choices that were made to keep their base narrow instead of trying to grow their base and political power. So that is absolutely true. Um, the other thing, though, is allowing the takeover of religious institutions by the right, because religious institutions used to, on balance, be left leaning. Um, and ceding that space has been a really bad mistake because that was also one of the bulwarks of community that is locally rooted movement spaces, right? Even now, even today, right? Like meetings happen um, in the spaces that churches own, right? Churches and synagogues and mosques are still one of the most important civil society organizations. There are just fewer of them, and fewer people are members of them, and fewer of them are center to the left. That is also something that people are thinking very seriously about now. But having ceded that space was a real big mistake. Yes. I think that one of the things that happened after the social movements of the middle 20th century was that people on the center to the left, let's call them leftish folks, poured a lot of their hope into government institutions, right? Like governing institutions, and felt that the remaining progress that was needed and that would ever be needed would come through these governing institutions. It would come through the courts. It would come through um, basically the national and federal government, right? Increasing federal agencies, et cetera. And it turns out that if all your eggs are in that basket, right, then those things can be captured, and there was never a belief that, or I think a suspicion that those things could be captured um, and utilized for um, non-egalitarian and anti-democratic ends. And so I think that the less sort of leftish part of the American movement poured all of its eggs into those baskets instead of cultivating its strongest civil society institutions, unions, and churches or religious places of religious worship.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, because in essence, the American left became post-political, essentially, is what they tried to
Mm,
do. And
yeah.
so they thought that politics and civil society were the same thing, and they're
Yes.
not, and they never have
No.
been.
That's really correct. I do think that's true. I mean, I think this is where the kind of myth of the end of history really comes to bite you, right? The idea that uh, all of the big decisions have been made, right? The worldview has been settled. Now is just the time of perfecting it, and you perfect it through these institutions, right? You don't have to cultivate these autonomous spaces where people are having big ideas or are pushing forward major reorganizations or transformations or correctives. We don't have to invest in those things because you're right. I like the idea of post politics, right? It was this notion that you could sort of sanitize the process so that we're only kind of horse trading about policy rather than having big, profound, important discussions about worldview, right? And the way that
Yeah.
we should live and who we are as a country or who we are as a world.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, it was accurate to say that, intellectually speaking, after World War II, there was no, there was the intellectual case for reactionary viewpoints had completely been destroyed. Like everybody saw what happens if you let far right people get what they want.
Mhm.
Literally millions of people dead. That's what
Mhm.
happens when you let them have what they want. And so people didn't want that. But
Yes.
as uh,
Yes.
uh, but as the memory of that faded,
Yes. That's
that then
exactly,
people,
it's like yes, it's like the generation who lived that died,
yeah,
and then everybody was like, "Hey, maybe this wasn't so bad."
yeah,
It's like the living that's an important thing to remember, right? That the living memory uh, of a people, particularly a people who doesn't have a really strong culture of um, retelling the old stories as though they're particularly relevant to today. So a modernist culture that is very like all about the contemporary. Once the living memory passes, then it's harder for people to hold on to what the actual consequences of things are, and it's much easier to rewrite history, right, and its interpretations. I mean, that's always a possibility, but it's particularly a possibility in a culture that's so presentist that if you
Yeah.
don't have the people who actually lived through it to be like, yeah, hello, absolutely not, then you
Yeah.
have the danger.
You do, and I would say that this is kind of a this is an artifact also of that the American political culture is a Protestant political culture, because when you look at
Mhm.
European countries, it overwhelmingly, generally speaking, it's the countries that are Protestant that have the strongest, most extreme movements. Now, there are some further right parties in more Catholic countries like Italy,
I
for
was
instance,
I was gonna say, yeah.
but at the same time, they are not, they're not trying to dismantle their healthcare. They're not trying,
Mhm.
like they have some economic things that they still believe in civil society and are not trying to destroy it. Now they are more anti, they're just as anti-immigrant or things like that. But they also, for instance, are trying to say that, like in France, for instance, that they ban or they want to ban women from wearing a veil, Muslim women, because they
Mhm.
say that that's a repression of women.
Mhm.
So in some sense, like that Catholic culture gives a little bit of because Catholicism as a political culture is more multifaceted. So in other words,
Mhm.
there are far right elements, anti-democratic elements, but there have always been,
Yes.
dignitatis humanae. That also is a very long-standing tradition within Catholicism, whereas Protestantism tends to have an idea, this, everything is de novo. The truth,
Mhm.
I am the arbiter of
Right,
what's
I'm the
true.
arbiter of the truth.
My brain is what decides true. And Immanuel Kant really kind of put that up with his, that like his idea that, well, through the categories of understanding we can
Oh,
have
yeah,
universal truth.
yeah.
And it's like, you say,
Mm.
like no Catholic would ever believe such a thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I would have to sort of like make a study of this, but yeah, I mean, I hear you on that, and certainly there are some very deep liberation traditions within the Catholic worldview. I mean, look at the current Pope, right? Like Chicago Pope is like
Yeah.
really kind of coming out of the gate swinging for migrants, and so which is obviously completely in line with the book, but at the same time, there are right wing Catholics who pretend that's not the case. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I do think you're right about the kind of de novo orientation, and maybe its roots in Protestantism. But it's also the case that Protestant traditions had been used for liberation as well, right? Like, so
Absolutely, yeah.
during the 19th century, the fact of um, the fact that there had just been the second revival was really instrumental in getting the abolitionist movement off the ground, for example. So, I don't think it's inherently one or the other, but it's certainly that the dominant orientations of the religious organizations that exist in America today certainly have the right wing um, Protestant, but also Catholic, kind of feel. The ground was just ceded to those people in the middle 20th century, and secularism was seen as the sort of like chief virtue uh, of of I think leftist intellectualism, um, and much more space should have been made for people of faith and cultivating these kinds of sensibilities in faith communities, because of course the roots of them are already there. I mean, it's the books are quite compatible with the kinds of
Yeah,
politics,
yeah.
for the people of the book.
For
So
a liberationist democratic politics, absolutely, yeah. And actually, well, I'll have put a link in the show notes, but I did a whole episode about I have a friend that's a political scientist that he did a study with a partner about how the decline of the Black church actually has made for more Republican Black people,
yeah, no, it
because
absolutely has. Yeah,
those churches were the repository of memory. Like that's,
100%.
like there has to be both a memory of misery and a vision of progress. And you have to have both of those things in order
Well,
to
yeah. I mean, I
really
don't
move
know if it's
forward.
misery, but it's certainly critique, right? It's definitely the place where, relatives and people who might as well have been relatives would call you to account for the kind of presentist thinking that discounts the experience of people who you are tied to. I think that's absolutely true. I think one of the findings in political science, in terms of Black politics, linked fate, this notion
Yeah.
of linked fate. Um, People, I think, wrongly interpreted that as something that was just a feature, like a permanent feature of Black politics. But
Yeah.
of course, it was a configuration of Black civil society.
It was an
And
artifact,
so,
actually.
I'm sorry?
It was an artifact. That's what it was.
Well, it wasn't an artifact, it
A
was
production.
living.
It was something that was produced by Black civil
It was
society.
produced, absolutely,
That's what I
yes, it
mean
was
by it.
absolutely produced. That's right, it was built, an artifact in that sense, yes.
Yeah.
It's not inherent,
No.
because one thing that civil society organizations do is they create a space for meaning making. And so absent those spaces of collective meaning making, you have people making all sorts of different meanings, right? Depending on the things that they're connected to, and we haven't even talked about the online spaces that people are connected to, right, that shape their worldviews in the absence of these civil society organizations, particularly, it seems, for men and boys. So I think, yes, we have really, really misunderstood the significance of meaning making within organizations and the ways in which those things are not objective, right? Those things are subjective. They're about relationships. They're about interpretation, um, and people can come to believe all sorts of things. And the question is, what kinds of spaces do we have for the cultivation of pro democracy, egalitarian beliefs? And we don't have enough of them, and they're not well resourced enough.
No, they're not. And within cognitive psychology, there is this idea of what they call dual process theory. The idea that essentially we have two different cognitive modes for our thinking. And basically, you have your somatic instinctual reasoning, and
Mhm,
that's how we govern most of our affairs because it works very nicely, and it's
mhm,
quick,
mhm,
and it works nice, and it's our animal instincts. Animals use it, obviously, but not every animal. There's also the sort of a recursive reasoning or abstract reasoning that comes on top of that. And the problem for, I think, the left globally is that as science and liberalism became ever more recursive and ever more abstract, they lost track of the fact that a lot of people weren't brought along to those innovations and to that way of thinking, and that's where civil society and local institutions, they were that barrier to this reactionary somatic reasoning that says, well, these things that I don't understand, if I don't understand something, then it's a lie. If I don't understand how vaccines work, then they don't work. If I don't understand the history of trans people, then trans people are not real. If I don't understand, why, if I have a vision of a racial group as this or that, then they are that, and it's not
mhm.
my ignorance; it's their problem. And local institutions mediate those kinds of stupid and self-centered conclusions,
Well, they
but they're
can.
natural.
Well, I mean, I don't think that that's true. I do think that you're right about somatic processing, but I think that somatic and cognition work together.
Oh, they do.
Um,
Yeah. No, I'm
yeah,
saying.
I mean, it's not one over the other. But in any case, I think that our somatic processing doesn't necessarily dispose us ill
No. Yeah.
to
There's
difference.
nothing wrong with it. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with
Um,
it
um,
inherently.
Right. That's also a sort of part of conditioning and also what we believe about scarcity. Or what we experience in terms of scarcity of whatever it is. But I do think you're right. There are these mediating institutions, but I disagree. I mean, I think one of the things that I learned, for example, when I was studying the Black Lives Matter movement, is that they value, or what I learned there was how much people valued the somatic experience, right? This is the somatic experience of like the body keeps the score, right? For example, right? And um, thinking about the things that we know and the ways that we experience things in our body, and understanding that those things are politically meaningful is something that movements do understand. But I think that it is true that sort of mainline Democrats or liberals, in the kind of small L liberal sense, really do disavow um,
Yeah.
that way of engaging with politics, and it has been a detriment. But it's not just the case that our somatic responses dispose us toward um, being away from, or disliking the other, or the things that we don't understand. Our somatic responses can also condition us toward the pleasure of those things, right, as well. It really is, I think, the mediating institutions that tell us how to interpret those responses, because so much, I would say modern evangelical right-wing Christianity is about telling you how your body's positive responses to things are bad. Like, that you shouldn't have those responses in your body, or that God doesn't like you to have those responses. So I do think that it all comes down to mediating institutions. Even though you're quite right, we modern intellectual society and culture has devalued the things that we learn from that somatic processing system, and hasn't, I don't think, equipped us or allowed us to equip ourselves with the ways that we can get information from. We should get information from the interaction between those two processing systems.
I definitely agree with that. And actually, that was the point I was rather poorly apparently trying to make. Um, that
I'm just really, I don't like it when people talk down the somatic system. So that's
oh
so
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
perhaps quite defensive about it.
Okay, yeah, no, no, like, but no, that is, I am literally saying we have to have both of these
Yeah.
types of reasoning because, in fact, abstract reasoning is a tool of somatic reasoning. Like,
Yes.
so within
Yeah.
conventional dual process theory, they say, oh, abstract reasoning corrects somatic reasoning. No, somatic reasoning allows itself to be persuaded. It's the boss. It's the boss.
Mm,
And so
mhm.
if you can't relate your politics in a somatic way, then you're not going to win in a democratic system. It's that simple. Like you have to, and that's part of what these, like local institutions really do. They give you a somatic experience with other people that is healthy,
That's right.
and you're
I agree with
relating
that.
to their body in your own body. Like in other words,
Yeah.
somatic reasoning isn't good for understanding math or understanding tax rates or things like that. No, we shouldn't use it for that. But on the other hand, if understanding that if somebody has a different sexual orientation than you, that it's just as real for them as your own is for you, and
Mhm.
that's a proper use of somatic experience, and just being with other people in friendship, and
Yeah,
having that in-person bodily experience with other people, where people are missing that, and it makes them
it's true.
vulnerable to this angry reactionary somatic
Yes.
reasoning, and
I
that's
agree
why
with
we have to
that.
make room for positive
Yeah.
somatic experience.
I really like the way you put it. Somatic reasoning allows itself to be persuaded. I think that is so interesting. I really, really like thinking about it in that way. Because I think that's quite true. We try to think about what it is about being among and being with other people that helps us to make meaning, and that helps us to and that meaning making is both, sort of at the level of cognition, and also at the level of belief, or faith, or whatever else. But I really do like that it is the somatic system that makes that opening, right, that allows itself to be persuaded. Um yeah, it really aligns with some other work. It helps me actually understand the work of, for example, Audre Lorde a lot more. She has this fantastic essay called The Uses of the Erotic, and erotic here is very broad. It means this somatic pleasure, um, sort of apparatus that we all have. And I have always had trouble understanding it as deeply as I think it should be understood. But because she asserts that it is this system that allows us to relate across difference. And so it really makes sense, this notion that it is the somatic system that allows itself to be persuaded, it allows itself to be moved, because that is the kind of information that allows us to be transformed, right? Allows us to adapt in ways that are profound.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And when you look at evolutionary biology and the evolution of cooperation among species, that empathy, that is the grounding, and it is a somatically derived
Mhm.
sensation and intellectual idea.
Mhm.
And this connects to one of the other movements that you've studied as well, the movement for same-sex marriage rights.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
was a movement that I think really did connect to that very well and help people understood that, you may not have the same desires or ideas about, relationships as people who are, naturally homosexual if you're a heterosexual. But that's okay, because they are still people just like you. And that's, that movement or that idea, like, they did a lot of things right, and I think people didn't listen to what they were doing enough, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly the approach for that movement was one in which um, everybody understood that they were going to have to persuade, right? And they were going to have to persuade in as many registers as was possible. And I do think that that really matters, and I write about that in my book, The Politics of Common Sense, because one thing that that movement never took for granted was that it had a natural constituency. One of the things that I do think does become a problem with left movements, again, because of this notion of scientific, right, the scientific sort of truth or real interests or things like this, is that they have a natural constituency that doesn't have to be actively persuaded, or that persuasion doesn't have to be maintained. And I think that's always a mistake, because it really is, like, politics really is a contest. It really is always a contest. And you always have to be cultivating the people who are your constituents and members and allies, your team. Um, um, and and there's no sort of scientific or logical or structural reality. Um, and things may be scientific and logical and structural. I think that those things are true and exist, but that does not create a constituency. A constituency is made through meaning making, and you always have to be thinking about persuasion.
You do. Yeah, and you're absolutely right that, this evangelical mentality, like, that's
Yes,
politics is an evangelical activity, and it
it,
has
it,
to
it
be conceived of
is.
that way if you want to win.
Yes, I agree with that. I don't know that I've ever thought about it in those terms, but it's really true. And I always joke about myself as a true believer in democracy, like small d democracy, like having a zeal. But I think that it's actually true. I think you do have to have a kind of zeal, um, uh, where you're not only trying to convince people that you have the right issue positions, but that you're actually trying to make them or help them, welcome them, invite them into your vision of the world, right? Because that matters more than issue positions. And we see this in the data all the time, right? Like, people have particular issue positions and they misattribute them to the candidate that they like the most, right? Or they deny that that candidate disagrees with them, or if they are presented with evidence that the candidate disagrees with them, they paper over it as insignificant for some other reason. But it's because it's not the issue position that matters most. It's the idea that that person represents some version of either yourself or the world that you believe in, right? That you think is worthy of your belief, and at least to a certain extent, your faith, right? I do think that that is true. And so I think that sort of trying to pinpoint and triangulate issue positions is absolutely the wrong approach. It's about trying to make people, trying to help people to feel that you want the same kind of world that they want and that they have a place in the world that you want to build. This is one of the reasons that I really, really appreciate Zoran Mamdani's campaign in New York, is that in addition to being consistent on issue positions, what that campaign has tried to do is to really create experiences for people to walk into, like literally, right? Experiences for people to walk into, because they really want people to feel, right, in their bodies that they have a place in the vision of New York that he wants to implement. That's really smart. That's the way you have to do politics.
It is, yeah, and especially if you're trying to do a politics that does include an expansion of personhood. Because throughout the entirety of human history, up until just very recently, women were not people.
Mm,
And people, and heterosexuality, well, I mean, it was kind of invented, but like in the Victorian age and afterward,
mhm,
heterosexuality was kind of assumed to be the only sexuality. And just all these various things that conceptions of being and who is a human. A lot of people, they never were taught that by their parents or the tradition that they came out of. Like a lot of Americans, they went to private Christian schools where they told them that evolution is not real, and that
mm,
feminism is from Satan, and that it's a threat to men. Or like
mm,
and a lot of churches will tell people that. And so it's
mm,
no surprise that if you're not continually making that case, then the
mm.
opposite, that people are going to fall back into what they were brought up from their childhood to believe in. And yeah,
Yeah.
you
I
have to
mean,
talk to them.
yeah, I mean, to the extent that that is an experience, I think that's certainly true. Um, it's also the case that you really have to stand behind the things that you believe. That is one thing that I also see in leftish politics. Um, Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how. Uh, I think center left politics is what I'm talking about right now. Is that you really have an unwillingness to stand for things. If there's a whiff that they might be unpopular in some constituency for some moment in time, the instinct is to retreat, and that is also not the way to conduct a politics of persuasion, right?
Yeah,
You want to make space for discussion, um, possibly. And you certainly want to be making your point in as many spheres as you can, but you don't retreat from the thing that you say you believe. If you do, then no one will believe anything that you say. And I think that
including the
that
people
is
that agree with you.
exactly. And I think that that is the situation that the Democratic Party finds itself in right now. And there is research that supports this, although it comes mostly from qualitative research, so focus groups, more than it does from polling. But that you have a situation with the Democratic Party is that even people who prefer many of their issue positions simply do not trust them to deliver on anything. And it is part of that's the part of the problem with trying to sort of triangulate issues as though issues are the thing that matter most to people. Whereas it's really about being invited into a worldview that you think that decision makers will actually fight for, that you have a place in and that they will fight for. um, we talked about this a little bit in our sort of like pre-conversation, but this is where the sort of double haters come from. These are people who, or what were called double haters during the 2024 campaign, the people who didn't like Harris or Trump, but they are also people who don't like the Democrats or the Republicans. And it's not because there are no issue positions that they agree with. It's because um, the issue positions that they have are heterodox, and they don't think that either are going to deliver for them, or that the one that's going to deliver for them and is not going to deliver what they actually want, right? So you have this situation in which people will say things like they trust the Trump's Republican Party to do things, even if they don't like the things that they do, and they don't trust the Democratic Party to do things, even if they would like the things that they say they want to do.
Yeah. And actually, Bill Clinton had a phrase for that when he was running for, or when he was the president. He said that people will always go for strong and wrong over weak and right.
Well,
And
that may be true, but Clinton had a lot of sayings, but I do think that it does bear on this particular political moment. There's a high degree of disbelief in political institutions, politicians, and candidates generally speaking, but the Democrats bear the brunt of that disbelief because it comes not only from opponents but from their constituents, who they seem to have a ton of disdain for also. But yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And that's got to change. Well, and one of the other, I think, enduring myths of leftish politics in the US is that the right wing is just has so much more money. And that's something that I've recently written about in my ebook, What Republicans Know. But that's something that you knew already as well, Diva. So let's talk about that. That you've been trying to get people to understand that we have plenty of money, we just have to spend it better.
Yes, yes. It's really, really hard to get people to believe that the center to the left has more money. It just has more money.
Objectively, that's an objective fact.
Objectively, there's more money
Yeah.
on that side of the spectrum, both from larger donors, but even more so from its rank and file. When you see candidates who are raising, astronomical amounts of money from small donors, they're always on the center to the left, right? There are these leftish candidates, or often progressive candidates, who are just raising an enormous amount of money from people in the world. There's also donors on that side. But the thing is that these resources are not coordinated in a way that invests in civil society or promotes a transformative worldview. And I do think the promotion of a transformative worldview is really important right now because most people want transformation. That is also evident in the polling, which is new, right? You didn't used to have polls where you asked, there was recently a poll, I think like this past summer, where they asked people, does the system need to be majorly transformed or torn down altogether? And something like 70% of respondents said it needed to be majorly transformed or torn down altogether, which is like unheard unheard of. That is not the sort of data I was raised on, right, as a political scientist, but that's the situation we find ourselves in now. And so a kind of status quo maintenance of worldview is not one that is going to work for most people. So absolutely, I think that the money that exists on the center to the left spectrum is not spent in a way that is efficient, in a way that exhibits conviction, in a way that is meant to deliver for its constituencies, deliver in multiple ways, either ideologically or materially. And that has to change, but it can change, right, relatively quickly.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, and like in terms of where the money is spent, Harris and her allied organizations had more than $2 billion in
Mm.
2024,
Just printing money. Yeah.
and all that money is gone now. Like
Yeah.
it's completely flushed down the toilet, and even worse, a lot of it went to Fox, and a lot of it went to Sinclair, and a lot of it went to Nexstar. So money that hardworking donors of Kamala Harris who really wanted her to stop Trump, that money was given to right wing media. A lot of
Mm.
hundreds of
Mhm.
millions of dollars of that money was handed to
Mhm.
Rupert Murdoch. Like
Yeah.
that's outrageous.
It is outrageous.
And and I'm sure if the donors had known that that's where the money would go, they wouldn't have given it.
Well,
Have to
certainly the
imagine
small
that.
donors.
Uh,
Certainly the small donors. I think the large donors do know that it goes there.
yeah.
And
Well,
they
they.
are just, well, there's this fantastic work by a political scientist called Jake Grumbach that shows the gerontocracy, right? Like, so that the age of politicians today, but then also more recent work is on the donor basis. And the balance now, of course, large donors tend to be older because it usually takes some time to amass an enormous amount of money. Even to come into money that you've inherited takes some time. So that's one part of it. But the donor base, in terms of large donors of Democratic candidates, is uncommonly old, right? Uncommonly elderly, and they tend to give money in way. They tend to give money into a party that pretends that it's still operating in the 1990s and spends money the same way that it did in the 1990s, right? On these TV ads, on like last minute canvassing, on micro targeting based on data. That's not actually about building relationships with constituents, and that it's not fundamentally about investing in local organizations, right? All of that money, can you imagine if, a quarter of that money had been put into shoring up local civic organizations that would be doing groundwork for Democratic candidates across election cycles, right?
Yep.
That would have been immensely powerful, and create a constituency that is actually always doing politics, right? Not only at election time. And so, yeah, it's a huge miscalculation. And as you have written, that is not the same case on the right. And it's not because of the Republican Party. The Republican Party operates very similarly to the Democratic Party in terms of how it uses money. It's just that so much of the money on the Republican side doesn't go through the party, whereas
Yeah.
so much of the money on the left does go through the party.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that the donors on the right, they have a vision of what they want, and they pursue it through thick and thin. And I think we can see that
Yes.
also as well, just like with
Mhm,
their attitude toward media. So like Rupert
mhm,
Murdoch, he's owned the New York Post since the 1980s. It's never made a profit. The Washington
mhm,
Times newspaper was started in 1987, never made a profit. You got One America News, never made a profit. Like tons of these organizations,
mhm,
they persist because both their big donors believe in them, but they also raise a lot of money from small donors. Like like
mhm.
Real America's Voice, you watch their things every
Yeah.
few minutes. Give us money, give us money, give us money,
Mhm.
and they do, and they
Yeah.
do because
Mhm,
their viewers know that it's important that these things exist.
mhm.
I think the left in the U.S. has to get over this allergy to money. Uh, they have to realize you cannot expecting people to hold on, my things falling out. That you have to understand that expecting people to say, gosh, this is a really righteous cause, I'm going to support it, or or like the kind of fantasies of Republicans on the West Wing, they'd be like, oh gosh, you gave a really good speech,
Yes.
now I have to surrender,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
persuaded
You're
me.
you're right on the merits.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like that's not how this works.
No.
You have to be there, be there in the world, and you have to be where people are, and you have to meet them where they are. Like
Mhm.
on my when I was talking about my book on social media the other day, somebody was like, "Well, I don't like videos. I don't like TV. I don't like YouTube. No liberals like it. We like to read because it's faster and it's better." And
Okay.
I'm like, well, okay, maybe that's what you think, but guess what? You live in this country with 300 million other people, and I'll tell you something. Most of them don't like to read articles from the Nation or the New Republic. I love them. I want to write for them. But that's not how that's not how you win in a democracy. You got to be where the people are in every way.
Yeah, and you have to cultivate those other spaces too. I mean, I just think that I think that the point about having the courage of your convictions is really important, and being able to hold these spaces at a loss, and not just being able to, like, understanding that that's a long-term, uh, 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 thing to do that is positive, right? That will have positive externalities and returns in the future, even if you're holding them at a loss now. That's really important. It's also really important to understand in our analysis as the ownership of legacy media shifts, right? People who are sort of like making fun of the fact that the Washington Post keeps losing subscribers, or that X is mostly just a bot farm now, right? And that it doesn't make any money, are confused about what the new ownership wants out of these organs,
Yeah,
right?
that's not what it's
Um,
there for.
it's not what it's there for. It's not what it's there for, right? It is not there as a business proposition. It is there as an ideas machine. And to understand that um, leftish folks have to invest in their own ideas machines, and in ways that are less uh, that allow more autonomy to those organizations. Generally speaking, the way that money is given on the left has to be given uh, in a way that allows more autonomy to the organizations that exist or are forming. Because that is also a part of doing politics, is that it has to be adaptive, right? It has to be able to serve and grow the constituencies that are actually there on the ground. And that requires long term funding that has many fewer strings than come with, for example, nonprofit grants that are reviewed every couple of years and may or may not be renewed. This hamstrings what's left of leftish civil society to an enormous degree. Both those organizations that provide services that could be the root of parallel institutions, right, for governance and service provision, but also for those that are interested in ideas, policy, and then also something that you talk about that I think is really important is that civil society is also a way to provide jobs and resources for the people who are fighting for the worldview that you say you want, right? If the leftish people have their own civil society organizations that are independent of governing institutions, which are now captured, right? And legacy media institutions, which are now captured, then it gives them a place where they can continue to produce, right? The ideas and push forward pro-democratic, pro-egalitarian ideas in a way that they can be less afraid, because they're not afraid that the folks who have captured these other institutions can now end their livelihood, right? These things are really, really important. The fact that the best reporters have been pushed out of the Washington Post is a huge opportunity for somebody, right? And it's one that hasn't been taken up.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also an opportunity for people, with the smaller dollar donors as well. And that's
Yes.
something that you've been focusing on as well. With people developing mutual aid groups and ICE reporting organizations,
Mhm.
and ways of supporting. And because like I often hear people say, "Well, we need to have a general strike." Well, and it's like people
Yeah,
need to have money in order to have a general strike. Someone has to pay
absolutely.
for them to eat if
There
there's a
has to be
general
a
strike.
strike fund like nobody's business.
Yeah.
Yes. And if people are serious about wanting a general strike, which is not a bad idea, general strikes are really effective in terms of regime change. But the preparation for a general strike is not what I is not happening, right? And um, if that's the goal, then there are many, many concrete things to do that can be done, right? And even if general strike is not the goal, all of those underlying things should still be done because those are the things that create autonomy, right? And so Yeah, absolutely. Investing in mutual aid, trying to shore up organizations that can provide services, basic care, provision of basic needs. That's another part of this and another worthy node of local investment. You know, and there are many ideas about how this could happen, right? Both from folks who are small donors who used to give their money to the Democratic Party. There are local organizations that they can invest in, both their money and their time, insofar as any of us have time. But yeah, to that extent. But then there's also ways in which other kinds of organizations, like party organizations, could function differently as well. Um, there are lots of ideas about this, particularly as SNAP runs out, the ways that local party offices could be utilized as spaces where mutual aid takes place, where people could find civil society organizations that have stockpiled food, that are able to give stipends for diapers, or have donation centers for things like basic needs that can help carry kind of people through. And if you were a party who wanted to build a loyal constituency, you would do that, right? So there are many, many opportunities to kind of create the kind of base, right? And the kind of capacity that would be necessary to be autonomous enough from this regime to refuse and to force changes. Um, and there are people thinking about that. I don't mean to say that like nobody's doing this. There are people who are doing this, but it needs to be done in a more coordinated manner. And I think with a orientation that is more confident, that is less doomy and gloomy, and more full of the kind of belief um, that nobody wanted to be sort of handed this. Nobody wanted to be handed this part of history, this stage in history. But here we are, and what are we going to do about it? And there's still plenty to do in terms of how history has gone, including the history of the United States. This is a troubled period, but it's not one of our most troubled periods, not yet. And so there's a lot of stuff that we can do besides being gloomy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we can't choose the times in which we live. We can
Yes,
only choose how we live in them.
that's right. Yeah. And for now, it's been a shock, certainly for those of us, at least for me, right? Those of us who were born into the late 20th century. And I know that, you know, many of us weren't raised to or weren't expecting to have to build a new century that would have to be really, really different from the one that we were born into. But we can do it. I mean, our grandparents did it, but it's time to really I don't know, to mix metaphors, step up to the plate, as it were, and do what we can. Um, but that also doesn't mean that everyone's a hero. That's the other thing about the small d democracy is that everybody pitches in the ways that they can, from the expertise that they have, from the capacity that they have, and are able to build with others. Um, and it's a long term proposition, not a short term one. So people who are expecting a kind of return to 2019 or 1999 just because you have a midterm election in 2026 are badly wrong, right? This is a long term process, but it is a long term process in which we can build something really enduring. Not forever, right? As we see, right? But something really enduring and something better, something good.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, so what do you have any recommendations for books or they can be by yourself or by others for people who want to keep thinking about all this stuff, do you?
Oh, yeah, gosh, I really recommend the book Cooperation by Bernard Harcourt. It's a really interesting study of cooperativism as a viable kind of political economic strategy that I think was very eye-opening for me. I had no idea how extensive cooperatives were. I thought it was just like the Park Slope Cooperative like grocery store. But no, this is a really, really interesting economic model that can work at scale. I think, what else is a really good? I think that the book From What Is to What If by Rob Hopkins, who is an environmentalist. It's a really, really interesting text. It is about political imagination, but the ways that political imagination can be enacted, right? And has many, many empirical examples and case studies of the ways that people are transforming their local communities and ideas for what it looks like to have that networked at scale. The
Uh,
final book that I would recommend is Here Comes the Sun by Bill McKibben. And this is a really, really good book because it details the technological advance that has happened literally in the last 2 years since 2023 with solar technology, and the ways that it has become viable as an energy resource at scale that's actually cheaper and better than fossil fuels and nuclear energy, which is something that literally was not true in 2022, but is true now. So these are the texts I think that I would recommend to help people think about the future, right? To really sort of claim the kind of ambition that is needed for this era, and it's an ambition that combines practical imagination with the kind of pragmatic, not in the case of triangulation, but pragmatic in terms of really trying to build and making manifest the pragmatic action which is needed right now. Um, yeah, that's what I'd
okay,
say.
yeah, they sound like great books. Now how about people keeping up with you? Where do you want to direct them to?
Well, people who are keeping up with me can follow my writing. I blog at Kettering. .org. I should say that. Oh, I should have said that before. I'm a fellow at a research fellow at the Kettering Foundation, which is a pro-democracy foundation, in based in America. It's American Pro-Democracy Foundation. So I think that in terms of my non-book and article thoughts, that's where you can find me.
Okay, sounds good. All right, it's been great.
Awesome. Thank you for inviting me on. Appreciate.
All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate you joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you are a paid subscribing member, you have unlimited access to the archives. And I thank you very much for your support. And these are tough times. I know, I understand not everybody can afford to do a paid subscription, but if you can't, please do share one of your favorite episodes on social media. Might be this one, or maybe another one. Please tell your friends and your family about the show. I really could use that support as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do click like and subscribe so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode. So that'll do it for this one. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.